Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for tonight's event. I'm Nick, the Director of Events. Today we have Jo Kaplan here discussing When the Night Bells Ring, their latest horror novel. We were very fortunate to have you, of course, in 2020 when everything went crazy for a virtual event, so we're so glad to be able to host you in person for your latest book. For everyone who's tuning in, she is a LA-based professor and writer, so we're very fortunate you're able to make the drive down here. If you have any questions that you want to ask during the event, you're more than welcome to, especially for our virtual audience, submit those under the link that says Ask a Question. We'll be answering those later on. And for everyone who is tuning in online, also this applies to everyone in person, we are still selling copies of the book, and also Jo's previous book, which we still have some copies of. You can get signed or personalized. Just make sure you click the link below that says Buy Book, and we can get signed and personalized. And if everyone in store, you can do that here. All right, I'll go ahead and leave for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's so nice to be here in person. The virtual event was a lot of fun, but this is such a great bookstore and really not a bad drive from LA. So I'm really happy to be here, and thank you for having me. And also thank you to some people in the audience, Jill, my agent, Andrea, my husband, Jake. Thank you for being here. So When the Night Bells Ring came out on Tuesday. So it's a brand new book. Thank you. And yeah, my previous novel was It Will Just Be Us. So that was a haunted house novel. And a reviewer recently commented on, going from a haunted house novel to something that's sort of completely different. Some writers really fall into a niche and they write sort of one thing. There are those like writers who really do haunted house novels all the time. So I thought that was an interesting comment, going from a haunted house novel to something that is like a Western horror. And I had never actually planned to write, I don't really know very much about Westerns, to be honest. I never planned to write a historical novel, but it ended up being a lot of fun to kind of research and look into the time period that it takes place. So When the Night Bells Ring has kind of two stories. There is a near future story that is kind of like a climate apocalypse. So it's sort of very, very near future because the Western US has been blighted by fire and drought, and it has really pushed people out of their homes. There are these two characters called Waynoka and Mads who were living in Los Angeles. That's where I'm from too. And there are all these fires and it becomes unlivable, right? And it's not really a happy future to look forward to, but they get pushed out. And so they go off through the desert seeking water because water is very scarce. It's hard to come by in this near future. And they find this ghost town in Nevada, and they think maybe there will be water somewhere in this mine, right? You think of mines as they go very deep. Some of them are flooded, so it's kind of a last-ditch effort to find some way to survive. So they go into this mine and they're looking for water. What they find instead, though, is a diary from the 1800s of this woman, Lavinia, who was a frontierswoman who brought her family to this town back in the day. And they start to read this diary, and it tells a story of these people being haunted by something that's coming out of the mine, by some ancient creature, some evil, and people are dying. So there is this element of something being haunted. And I guess that's why I didn't really feel like this book was a lot different from It Will Just Be Us, which was my haunted house novel. And that's why I thought that it was such an interesting comment. Oh, you went and did something totally different. I love exploring things that are, unusual hauntings, right? So in my previous novel, it's a haunted house, but it's not kind of just your typical ghosts. It's also sort of haunted by, it's really like echoes of the past and also possibly of the future. And then this novel, too, kind of takes the idea of haunting, right? This mine is haunted in some way, but it twists it a little bit. So I love exploring this idea of what it means to be haunted. And I feel like so much of horror really does that, right? What is it? What is haunting us? What is frightening us? What do we carry with us in our lives that we cannot let go of? And that's so much of this like haunting feeling. So hopefully that gives kind of an overview of what this book is about. Another thing I wanted to touch on with this novel that was a lot of fun was the historical research. And again, I had not ever planned on writing a historical novel before because the idea of doing research to make it authentic just seemed like a lot of work and really difficult. But it ended up being a really fun element of this book. And I did get to really go into, looking into what it was like on the frontier, what it was like in these mining communities in the 1800s. I read these firsthand accounts by women at the time. And that was really what interested me, because you think of Westerns as being very male oriented, guns blazing, dudes running around on on their horses shooting each other. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to see what were the women doing at this time. So I read some like diaries of women to try to capture the voice of Lavinia Kane, who is my frontierswoman. And I learned some kind of fun little facts. So here's a couple fun facts about the Old West. and I'm thinking about the Old West as this takes place in Nevada. So think a very dry climate. We're like kind of out in the desert. There was a lack of wood. So that meant they had to get very creative in what they built their houses out of. Some fun things I found when I researched. There were houses made out of oil cans, barrels, and empty beer bottles. And there are still bottle houses in some ghost towns. I think Riolite, Nevada still has a bottle house. There is a brief mention of a barrel house in When the Night Bells Ring, because I thought that was such a fun little touch. Also, because there was a lack of wood, it meant there was a lack of fuel for cooking. So families had to use buffalo chips, which is dried bison dung, as fuel. Luckily, when they burned it, it did not smell like poop. Women at the time would, well, first of all, their lives were filled with just like endless toil and drudgery. And I try to capture some of that in Lavinia's experience in the book. But they had their social events too. One thing they did was quilting bees. And they called their quilts diaries or albums because they would tell stories about their lives. And they would also create their own patterns for their quilts, and they would name them. So in the book, Lavinia goes to a quilting bee to meet the other women in the town. She works on a pattern. She calls it the Cactus Trail. And she learned some interesting things from the other people at this quilting bee because, of course, it's also the place for gossip. So those are my fun facts about the Old West that I enjoyed learning about for this book. And they're fun facts, but also there was a lot that was obviously not very fun about the Old West. And I also like the idea of being able to take horror and transpose it into these different locations. You know, there's the classic Gothic story, which I feel like I was aiming for with It Will Just Be Us. But how do you take that and put it somewhere unusual, right? Take the fog-drenched moors of the Gothic setting and throw it into the sun-bleached desert, which is where this takes place. Take the crumbling castles and throw that into a decaying ghost town. And I think you can achieve the same thing and maybe explore Gothic horror in a slightly new or different way by recasting it or recontextualizing it to this new place. So that's also kind of something I really enjoyed doing with the Old West storyline of this, as well as the kind of near future climate apocalypse story, because both of those sort of converge in the book. So I think with that in mind, I'll go ahead and read a couple of sections. And because there are these two storylines, I wanted to read a little bit from each one So I do have two sections. One of them is from Lavinia Kane's story, and she is the frontierswoman, so it's her diary. And then I'll read the other part. So I'm going to start with the Old West. And this maybe will give you a little taste of her life, as well as what's kind of going on in this town called Virgil, Nevada. So much of our nourishment is dried and salted. We elected to trudge into town and assess what victuals are to be had in the grocery store. I was plumb delighted to find Sophie hungry for once, and thought her hard knocks must be at an end. Oscar dashed about ahead of us, kicking a rock across the ground, while Sophie held my hand primly. "Mama," she said to me as we passed onto Main Street, "why are there bells on all the doorways?" Indeed, she was right. I had not noticed it before, but it is just as she said. As soon as I saw them, I could not imagine how I had missed them. Little silver bells hanging not just from the doorways of the shops, the boarding house, the post office, the two-story stone courthouse, but also from the doorway of each cabin and residence we had passed. Every last building had a bell over its entrance. Why this should disconcert me so, I cannot say. On the edge of town, rugged hills and mountains carve up the pale, dusty sky. One can see the buildings of the mine from here. It is so close. It is, after all, the town's lifeblood. Virgil would not exist without the Virgil Consolidated Mining Company. And out beyond the edges of Virgil loom strange rocky hills, toxic plants and evil cacti. Nothing here is familiar. Indeed, Virgil seems to be a lone outpost amid a vast wilderness. I suppose the bells are so they can hear when someone is coming, yet it seems strange to me why there should be one on every building. Perhaps the people here do not like to be caught unawares. Sophie asked me if we would put a bell on our door as well, gazing up at me with those eyes of deepest blue. I do not think I would like having a bell on our door, jangling intrusively every time one of us goes in or out. It seems a dreadful intrusion on the quiet. Claudia will know what it means. I must ask her of the bells, why they are there, though I fear I may encounter her reticence once again. September 6th, 1869. Today I secured us a goat and 2 sheep. I attempted also to identify what sort of crops might grow on our land, only to be stymied by the grocer's laughter. "All hard pan out there," he said. "You won't get naught but weeds." Even the sheep seem resentful of the lack of good eating. Their eyes seem to accuse me so. If only I could explain to them in a language they might understand that we are all making the best of things. Perhaps my stroking them puts them at ease. I often find the company of animals a balm unlike any other, a contentment one simply cannot find among people. Animals have an utter honesty and sincerity about them. They are incapable of the lies and manipulations that contaminate human society. It is too late in the season, besides, to do much planting. Winter will be upon us in short order. Yet the days remain hot even now, as in the thick of summer, and excessive dry. There is but little rain and nary a cloud to blot out the overbearing sun. By this time of year, Boston would be cool and rainy, the air ripe with the soft moisture of the sea. I filled my bucket with water from the pump outside the grocery store, and my arms strained as I lumbered back down the street with it, as well as the sack of feed thrown over my shoulder. Others were about, and I heard hushed conversations as I passed. Perhaps they did not know I could hear them, or perhaps I have acute hearing. "Help the poor girl out," said one. "That's one of the new ones, the Kanes," said his companion, and they turned away from me. I lowered the bucket and set myself down for a spell, the sun hot on my back like all fire. I swatted flies from the sweetness of my sweat, and I felt alone as a body can feel. It was just as if the other people about town were only flies buzzing away from me. It reminds me of Boston, in the latter days of our shame, when we had become pariahs. If it had only been the bucket or the feed, I wouldn't have had such trouble, and perhaps I ought to have made 2 trips after all. But now that I had both, I was determined to get them back to the cabin, and I was all on my own, so I had a double burden upon me. Just as I was beginning to gather myself to continue, I found that I was in sight of the boarding house, and I wondered if Claudia was in. It took me another few minutes to bring myself to its porch. Yet the notion of a brief respite from the toil, to call on the one person in town who has shown me an ounce of kindness, seemed to me a merry prospect, so I set down my bucket and feed on the porch and went inside. The parlor was more lushly appointed than the building's exterior suggested. There sat a scrolled velvet sofa against an elegantly patterned wallpaper, which appeared in a French style to my unworldly eyes. 2 young women in scandalously little clothing sat there with drinks in hand. Behind a counter stood the woman I took to be Miss Rosemary Shaw. So used to plainness, I was quite struck by this woman, who I can only describe as adorned. Fur on her shoulders, a pair of minuscule spectacles on her delicate nose, a feathered hat on her silver curls, striking jade earrings dangling from her ears. Though heavy-set and imposing, she was nevertheless a handsome woman. She turned to me on my arrival and appraised me quickly, then said, "Looking for work? Don't worry, dear. There are so many men in this town and so few women, no one will bat an eye at those homely looks." I told her I was only looking for Claudia. "Bernadette!" Miss Shaw snapped at one of the girls lounging on the sofa. "Up with you. Go and retrieve her." Miss Shaw's keen eyes turned sideways to me as the girl leapt from the couch and bounded up the narrow staircase. "You're lucky we're slow this time of day. Claudia is quite popular." She came down just as lovely as ever, wearing a plain white gown. Her hair was pinned up today, with loose curls hanging around her rouged face. She seemed surprised to see me here. Miss Shaw went off somewhere else, and Bernadette returned to her companion on the sofa, who had been holding her drink. With a tilt of her head, Claudia indicated that we had better step out onto the porch, so we did. My bucket and bag of feed became quite apparent at our feet, so I told her I had stopped for a short rest before carrying my burdens the 3 miles back, and had desired to thank her for bringing me to Emery's cabin. She glanced behind her, though we had shut the door on our way out, then looked back at me and said, "Let me help you." I attempted to decline. It would be far too generous of her to help me all the way back to the cabin, although she was at work. But she told me she was not busy right now and would very much enjoy a walk out of doors. So Claudia took the sack of feed while I hefted the bucket, and slowly we made our way down the dusty road. There was nothing to do but talk as we went. I didn't want to trouble her or frighten her off, so I did not ask her again what had happened to Emery, though I very much wanted to. To my delight, after correcting my pronunciation of her name, she taught me a few Spanish words. Let me see if I can remember them. Mantequilla is butter, gracias is thank you, amor is love. She offered to teach me more if I ever came round again. The walk was so much pleasanter with Claudia beside me, sharing the load. The cabin lay not far ahead of us when the distinct jingle of a bell shrilled nearby as a woman exited her home with a bundle of washing. I couldn't help myself. "May I ask, why are there all these bells?" She said the most peculiar thing. "The bells are so that we can hear when spirits are approaching. When you hear the bells at night, you know los fantasmas are about." This must be the quaint superstition of the town. It reminds me of those awful stories I have heard about poor souls who are inadvertently buried alive. How some will install bells above the grave with a string that goes down to the coffin, so that if one awakens to find himself wrongly interred, he may tug on the string to ring the bell and signal whoever might hear. The thought sends a horrible shiver all through me. How awful, the notion of waking in the dark of a little coffin, closed in by 6 feet of dirt, hoping that someone will hear your ringing before you truly perish. Maybe a little context for that part. Emery, she mentions Emery's cabin. Emery is Lavinia's brother-in-law, who she and her husband had been coming to this town because he said there was a mine and it was making lots of money. They were mining silver, and there were a lot of riches to be found here. She also mentions that they had become pariahs in Boston. There was some bad business dealings that turned sour, so they had to kind of run off. So they came here looking for her brother-in-law, Emery Kane, but Emery was nowhere to be found. So she ran into Claudia, at what she believed to be a boarding house, but perhaps there are enough hints there to tell you that's not quite what it was. She will learn that, don't worry. And Claudia ends up taking her to Emery's vacant cabin, and that's where they end up settling. And there is that mysterious idea of the bells, that is when the ghosts are out. So let me read you now just a brief portion of the near future storyline. This centers on what I call the Dust Devils, which is my pair of climate refugees, Mads and Waynoka. And at this point, they have already entered the mine, and Waynoka has begun reading Lavinia's diary and is scaring herself a little bit by reading these stories of ghosts in the Old West. A spasm of sound, sharp, metallic, echoing, threw Waynoka's heart into a lurch. The bell's peal crashed through her sleep and flushed her cold awake. Her eyes sprang open as the bell slowed to a gentle sway against that black entrance. I apologize, I should pause here and mention. So they're in the mine and they find this little room. That's where they find the diary. And there's a bell over the entrance to one of the deeper tunnels that they have not gone down yet. So she just woke up having heard this bell. Something had disturbed it. She hadn't even realized she'd fallen asleep, the diary open on her chest. A red-tinged light was fading, the fire in its death throes burnt to embers. She stared into the darkness as the bell went still, willing herself to go long intervals between blinks. Something had made the bell ring. She thought of the man who had died in Lavinia's time, and her heart lurched again. That ache bloomed into a swell of panic, which she forced down like a rising gorge. Panic would not help this far below the earth. But panic had followed her down the broken ladder into this warren of narrow tunnels where the darkness closed in like the tightening of her own throat as she tried to remember to breathe. With a quick crank to give it a little burst of juice, she aimed the flashlight into the tunnel. The bell flashed and the walls turned white as they receded into nothing. Trembling, Waynoka convinced herself to step toward the entrance and then through it. 20 steps in, her beam of light stuttered. She hurried to wind the flashlight as its flicker caught something moving or turning, caught what looked like two gleaming black marbles that made Waynoka think eyes. But by the time the light steadied, there was nothing there except for a dark lump on the ground. Cautiously, she drew closer, not understanding the shape, which she realized was distorted by the long shadow the flashlight threw behind it. When she recognized the shadow, she understood she was looking at another dead bat. She looked behind her at the bell, which by now had fallen still. Could the bat have rattled it when flying through the tunnel? And then it dropped dead all of a sudden? What, had the ringing given the bat a heart attack? She drew the flashlight beam back toward the bat and then all around, training it on the crevices in the walls to be sure there was nothing else here. Nothing with black marble eyes. When she felt she had been as thorough as possible, she returned to the little room and watched the dwindling embers, trying to convince herself of the plausibility of the bat heart attack narrative. She considered rousing Mads, but thought better of it. Her knee had swollen a grisly eggplant purple through the rips in her jeans, clotted blood turning black. Waynoka winced just looking at it, and then winced again when the throbbing in her head intensified. She missed pills. Ibuprofen, acetaminophen, aspirin, the stuff of gods. That warm rush as the headache magically receded after a couple of Advil, or when an extra-strength Tylenol suddenly took the edge off a stomach-churning bout of menstrual cramps. Mads would have to do without painkillers for the knee. Waynoka thought about Lavinia Kane, who knew no pharmaceuticals. What did she do when she had cramps? Toughed it out, Waynoka guessed. The way they had to do now as well. Nothing but a rag and a lack of sympathy. What a waste of suffering. And for what? Her heart by now had slowed to a calmer rhythm. She kept the flashlight aimed at the tunnel entrance, presided over by the painted ogre figure and the mercifully still bell. So much of history and all its advancements was about the alleviation of suffering, no matter the cost to the world around them. as if they had forgotten that humans were a part of that world, as if they could divorce their own suffering from everything else. What was it her grandfather had once told her? When the air suffers, the ground suffers. When the ground suffers, the trees suffer. When the trees suffer, the birds and the squirrels suffer. And when the birds and the squirrels suffer, so do we. Why birds and squirrels? He had never said. But by now, she thought she knew why the air suffered in the first place. Smoke burned her eyes and sent needles into her lungs. They were lucky they hadn't asphyxiated themselves. That meant there was enough ventilation, which might mean there were other ways out of the mine nearby. But it wouldn't do to relight the fire now and risk breathing in more tainted air, the kind of air that made her throat a rusty pipe. And even if there was a ventilation shaft nearby, who was to say they had any means of climbing it? Who was to say they could make use of it at all, except to shout impotently up into nothing, into the emptiness where no one would hear them? It reminded her of those Chilean miners years ago who famously had been trapped in the darkness for, 2 months? Except here the world wasn't watching. Here no one knew or cared who they were or why they were in this long disused and dangerously forgotten mine. Here no one was coming to help. They were on their own. And those are the ones you never hear about. You hear about the boys' soccer team trapped in a flooded cave in Thailand because of the daring rescue, the various nations that pulled together to send elite teams swimming down flooded tunnels. You hear about the resourceful ones too. The rock climber who sawed off his own arm after being trapped in a narrow fissure, who survived through his own stubbornness to have a movie made about him. You don't hear about the ones no one comes to save or who can't save themselves. The ones who disappear in the desert, never to be heard from again. Wainoka moved the flashlight around the room, livid shadows twitching in its wake, as if the room all around her was alive and crawling around just outside the focus of her beam. Her skin crawled in response. Lavinia had been down here at some point. There was nothing to indicate she died here. No body, no bones. That must be proof there was another way out. Wainoka wondered how long it took for bones to turn to dust. Her eyes danced around the chamber, sharpening on the grit that lined the floor, waiting to spot a tooth or some other telltale sign of death. There was nothing. Nothing in here, at least. How long had it taken those prospectors to dig out this vast labyrinth? All that work for a bit of gold and silver. Even if it meant burying themselves in earth, digging their own tombs, trapping themselves away from light and life, all for some useless silver. Gold hadn't stopped the drought's desiccation from turning green plants to dead sheaves of kindling. Gold hadn't stopped the fires from scorching the hillsides and filling the blue sky with smoke. Nor had it stopped the wave of newly unhoused from dying of heat stroke when summer hit hard and long, or the riots that followed, or the empty grocery store shelves when the supply chain broke down. The rich and powerful threw obscene sums of money at the problem, but it didn't stop any of that from happening. Wainoka stared at the dangling bell. Her ears strained to make out any hint of sound in the abyssal chasm beyond it. Did she hear a scrape? Maybe like a pickaxe, dragged against stone? It was too indistinct to make out its sharp edges. Or maybe she was only imagining it. She couldn't tell. But she stared at the bell, a silver beacon against a void, and she hoped the bat had had a heart attack. Thank you.
I think it's time for Q&A. Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask? We have some virtual questions here. What personal rules did you want to relay through your main character?
I'm sorry, what kind of rules?
What personal rules?
Personal rules. Oh, that's a good question. My main characters, I don't know if I give personal rules so much as I try to make them just feel like real people. And by real people, I mean flawed people who make the wrong choices a lot. When I read characters who are always doing the right thing and always making the right choices and they're just beset by bad circumstances, it never feels believable to me because that's just too perfect. And real people are not perfect. So always my main characters are not people that I'm like, I would love to have dinner with you, or I would love you to be my best friend, or you are my moral, you're the epitome of my moral compass. No, I always try to make them people who get thrown into difficult circumstances, and there's not easy choices that they have to make, and they don't always make the right ones, and sometimes they do bad things because they're just regular people. So I do think there is a difference between likable characters and sympathetic characters. I don't know that all of my main characters are completely likable in the sort of stereotypical sense, but I like to think that they are sympathetic in the sense that we can empathize with what they are going through, and even if we don't agree with the choices they make, we can understand them and see where they're coming from. And I feel like that's what really makes characters relatable to us, when we can feel what they are feeling, even if they're feeling things that we've never felt before. I've never been trapped in a mine, thank God. That's like my worst nightmare. I have never been a woman in the 1800s having to spend my entire life doing this horrible, mindless drudgery, but we can relate to those characters when we are put into their position and forced to feel the world from their perspective. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, but I'm going to go with that.
Did you have the idea for the journal story before you had the current or present story?
That is a really good question. And I'm trying to remember, to be perfectly honest, which, it's like the chicken or the egg, which came first. I do feel like I had the journal story first. I think that came to me first, but it was always intended to be that with I think of the other story as kind of like a frame story, because it is framing the journal. So they really did go hand in hand, but I do feel like I think I wrote most of the journal first, and then I kind of went back and fleshed in the other part. So that was definitely central on my mind.
Story or sub-story then harder to write because you had to plan it out more?
Weirdly, it wasn't harder to write. And again, I thought it was going to be, because it had all this historical research, and I really wanted to make it feel authentic, even if it's not, exactly what real life would have been like back then. I really wanted to make it feel authentic, like something that we could believe in. And I thought that was going to be really hard. and it is. It requires a lot of research, but it once I got into the groove of Lavinia's voice, it came out actually much easier for me. And I think that maybe that has to do with finding the right voice. And I know this is something a lot of writers think about a lot and maybe struggle with too. I do too, trying to find the right voice for a story. And her voice was just so distinct to me and so different from other voices I'd written that it kind of made it easier and just sort of came out pretty quickly.
We have another online question. What were the steps that you took to create the definition of haunted and the boundaries for it?
Ooh, I love that. First of all, I will say that I do think the definition of haunted is very malleable, which is why I love pushing it in these kinds of weird, different directions where it's not just ghosts. It's almost like this feeling, which is very hard to articulate, right? Feelings are very hard to explain. I was actually writing a blog post recently for the Horror Writers Association. They do a Halloween blog tour where people write blog posts about Halloween. And I spent my blog post trying to articulate, what is that Halloween feeling? Why do we love Halloween? And it's very hard to articulate. It's this creepy, unsettling, but also really enjoyable. I want to be unsettled. And trying to articulate that, I think, is trying to articulate what it means to be haunted. It's not just, here's a ghost. because I do think you can have ghosts without really feeling that like haunted feeling. If it's just like, blah, ghost popping in your face, or like a Scooby-Doo kind of ghost. But it's that feeling of like creeping dread, like something unnatural, something uncanny is happening around me, and I don't know what it is, and I can't explain it. And it's freaking me out because I can't explain it. Like, I don't know about you all, but I'm a bit of a control freak. So I like to be able to control things and explain what's going on. And if there's something that's like outside of that control, that's outside of our understanding, that's like on the edges of things that we can't reach out and grasp and figure out, but we also can't escape it. That, I feel like, to me, is this sense of haunting. So that's, I feel like, why I like to transpose that idea of haunting into not just haunted houses, but there's this haunted mind. And again, I'll tell you right now, it's not really ghosts. I won't tell you what it is. But it's not really ghosts. But I still tried to capture that feeling of being haunted by something in this mind, and it's this dark, creepy location, you know, and maybe you can't escape it. And you don't know what it is. And I think part of it is that mystery of not knowing what it is. Because even with ghosts, it's like we don't know what the afterlife is. And I think part of it is just that mystery that I really tried to dig into.
Thank you. I have another online question here. Was there a character that changed drastically from the initial story planning stages to the final published story?
Ooh, that is a good one. I could say in other stories that I've written, that has definitely happened. I think this is an interesting or maybe unique case for me, this particular book, because the finished book is very close to my original conception of it. And that does not always happen. Sometimes I will come up with an idea and it will go through a wild number of different incarnations and the characters will all be totally different. But the three really main characters in this book are Lavinia and then Mads and Waynoka. And I don't feel like they really changed from my initial idea of them. I think because Mads and Waynoka are a bit like kind of foils to each other. They're both trying to survive this sort of post-apocalyptic landscape, and Mad's a little bit older, a little bit more devil-may-care, and Waynoka's a little bit younger and a little more reserved and doesn't really know how to make her way in this weird world. So they always kind of seemed pretty clear. And then Lavinia, maybe again because of the way her voice came to me, a lot of her character, I guess for me, is her voice, because we're getting the entire story through her diary. So it's all through her perspective and her voice. And I think maybe because of that, once I found her voice, she kind of stuck where she was. Or at least with the character she was. She does change through the story and maybe make some decisions that, I don't know, are they the right decisions? Well, I have to read the book and find out.
I personally always find it interesting where authors get their stories, how they start the stories. I've heard of authors starting stories because they thought of a great title and so they went with it, or they actually create the characters first and they made a whole world around it, or they start with the world first. Where do you typically first approach when writing your story? What's your entry point into the story?
I am very much interested in places and how places affect us. So I do feel like I tend to come to the world first. I wanted to write a story about a frontierswoman in this place, in this dusty frontier town. I wanted to write about people getting trapped in a mine because that sounded terrifying to me. And so it actually kind of, it was like the world first, and then I figured out who the characters were that would be experiencing this and tried to tell their stories. It's funny that you mentioned the title. The title usually comes last for me, at least. And that's not intentionally. I just sometimes do not hit on the right title until the story has already been told. So that is a bit harder. But yeah, it's usually the world.
How far into your story drafting did you know the last line?
Ooh. So, okay, I always know the ending. That's actually something that is just part of my process when it comes to writing novels. Short stories may be a little bit different, but with a novel, I always have to know where I'm going. there's like an arrow in my mind pointing towards that final, maybe not the final line, but the final scene. How is this going to end? Where is it going? So I always know that actually very early on, like early on in the first draft. That very final line may change, but where it goes, what happens, the way that it ends, usually does not. I may change things in the middle of the book in terms of how we get there or like the order of events, but so far I have never changed where that's going. That's always like really important to me to have that sense of that there is a place this is going to, and that ending is really important to me because I think the ending is a huge part of the story. That's what you're left with. That's where everything was going towards. So yeah.
Getting a question from left field. If you had to give a book to someone that would be best to describe you, that wasn't one of your own written books, what would you give them?
That's a really good question. I like so many different kinds of books, but I guess at least thinking about When the Night Bells Ring in particular, like where I am with this story, I might have to say The Winter People by Jennifer McMahon. That was, it was kind of an inspiration as I was writing this one, and she does a lot of things with, exploring women characters, exploring the idea of being haunted, and there are also some like historical elements that come in and out that, I might go with that. But there's so many, so I'm not going to keep trying to list
Totally
more.
fair. And do we have any other questions from our in audience? All right. Well, I guess I'll leave it with one last question. What are you currently reading that you would like to give a shout out to?
Oh my gosh, I'm in between books right now. I was actually just reading a couple of, I try to keep up with the short story anthologies that I get published in. So I try to keep up because I want to read the other short stories in those. But so I'm a little bit between, but in terms of what I've just read, one of the recent books that I read that I absolutely loved was This Thing Between Us by Gus Moreno. Just a beautifully haunting, creepy, unsettling, and really beautifully written book. Definitely will shout that out. So, yeah.
And is there anything you're currently working on that you want to give a shout out to or hint at? I was just talking about this with my agent earlier tonight, kind of in a weird spot where I was working on two potentially different novels. But I am working on one thing right now, and I guess I will say that it is about a female-led metal band in a haunted forest. But again, by now, is it really, what do I mean by haunted? Well, yeah, I'll leave it at that. That sounds so good already. Thank you so much, everyone. Let's give a round of applause to Jo for being here. Thank you so much. And thank you, online audience, for also joining us. Don't forget, if you haven't purchased a copy yet, you can go ahead and do that at the link below. I hope everyone has a good evening or good day if you're watching this in the future. Bye.